So our keynote speaker tonight is Rowan White, and I can offer a short intro, and Rowan will also introduce herself. So a bit about Rowan's amazing work here. She is a seed keeper farmer from the Mohawk community of Akwesasne and a passionate activist for Indigenous seed and food sovereignty. She is the educational director and lead mentor of Sierra Seeds. She's the founder of the Indigenous Seedkeeper Network, an initiative of the Native American Food Sovereignty Alliance. She serves on the board of directors of the Seed Savers Exchange, the largest public access seed bank in North America. She is a facilitator, a mentor, a teacher, a mother, and she is, in my experience, what I have seen of her amazing work, she is a steadfast advocate for a dignified resurgence. I learned that term from her. Thank you. Rowan's use of incredibly beautiful language to convey difficult and complex concepts are an inspiration and a constant antidote to despair that we can feel in these times. And her commitment to life, her reverence for life is just apparent in everything that she does. So it is a true honor, and I am profoundly grateful to introduce our keynote speaker, Rowan White. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Great. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. That way we can enjoy all the beauty that I brought here. But Caitlin did invite us in to take a deep breath, and I'm also just going to invite us to settle in. I oftentimes remind us that there's a place inside of us where there's the headwaters of our breath, and I like that imagery for those of us who are water lovers and water protectors and defenders. And as I was making my opening notes, I just want to introduce myself, which I'll introduce you myself in my Indigenous language, Sego, Sewa, Gwego, Ganyat the Hawa Yungyats. I'm calling in from unceded Nisenan territory, which is in the Sierra foothills of Northern California. But my homeland, as Caitlin mentioned, is Akwesasne. I'm Snipe Clan from a beautiful community right on the New York-Canadian border. And we'll dive into some stories from my homeland and from my people. But as we settle in and as I invite you to find that headwaters of your breath, I brought just a small piece to read, just to sort of drop us into, cross that threshold of story so we can be together tonight here in this way. I was making my opening notes and I was thinking about the ways in which we are moving through difficult times, and many of us feel heavy-hearted, perhaps even frozen from the brokenheartedness of the current moment. We've all seen a lot, heard a lot, carried a lot in this last week, month, year, many years. And I don't think there's a single one of us that is around this storytelling circle tonight that is untouched by the grief of disconnection and perhaps that longing that comes from living in diaspora, right? And tonight's story is going to be about coming home and finding our way home from the multitude of diasporas that we all find ourselves in. Myself too, as an Indigenous woman, finding myself in some sort of ancestral or cultural diaspora, even though I still live on the continent of my ancestors, right? That we're all grappling with the splintered village or the splintered times that we're in. And the great cultural upheaval that we're all witnessing in this time. So I brought a piece just to read a short poem. And I actually wrote this poem on March 15th, 2020, when I had just come home from a trip hosting a gathering at Akwesasne for seeds and for food. And these words came out. And so I figured I'd share them here, and then we'll just dive right into some storytelling tonight. So this is called an expression of faith. An expression of faith in life herself is to sow seeds into dark soil, not knowing what awaits. Returning to the patience, reverence, grace, humility practiced by our ancestors, who knew how to feed the hungers of time that call down the rains with a simple song. It is those kinds of people whose memory courses through my veins like wild rivers, reminding me and us to wake up amidst the confusion and to do what must be done to feed the children, to tuck vibrant seeds into fertile soil and patiently tend the garden, our backs bent in service. To those whose faces look up at us from the well-worn path that we walk. The garden that our ancestors left for us is so beautiful. May we water it well with our tears and our laughter, our stories and our songs. Today, I choose to plant seeds of hope into the winds of an unknown future. And may we grow from this tiny seed of remembrance, this intimate immensity, perhaps coming completely apart, emerging out of the hard shell of generations of protection and prayer. Our seed coat tempered by love and loss, joy and pain, completely coming undone to reorient into a new form. For it's a new dawn, the time to be those ancestors that our grandchildren are waiting for is upon us. What seeds are you sowing? Maybe we can all just take a deep breath and feel how those words landed in the earth of our body. And then I'm just going to carry us through to some of the stories of the way this work has impacted me. So tonight we're gathering around this digital hearth to talk about something so near and dear to my heart, which is seed rematriation. And we're going to dive into a little bit more of what that might mean to me and the communities who I work alongside. And then there's going to be some inquiry for you to be thinking about what that might mean for you in your own farms and gardens and communities. So, but we must start at the beginning, right? We'll start here at the, perhaps it's even at the middle, I guess, because we're starting with where I entered the story, and sharing a little bit about my own journey of finding my way home through food and seed. And I imagine we're in this circle with many kindred folk who are also apprenticing ourselves to the land and to food and to seed and perhaps some of our ancestral traditions. I look back at my former self, my tiny little girl self, so proud of this lumpy, bumpy pumpkin that I had begged my mom to get this packet of pumpkin seeds and carve a little place out in our backyard to grow. And little did I know way back then, my younger self, would I have even ever realized that those seeds and those foods would be so generous and be such amazing, wise teachers for me along this path that I've followed for the last 25, 30 years. I bring a few pictures of some of my ancestors here. In the middle, you'll see my grandfather, Lincoln White, there with the sheep. That's the old White homestead at Akwesasne, our Mohawk community there along the banks of the St. Lawrence. That land is still in our family's stewardship, although I'm the first generation. My parents' generation didn't really grow up on the farm, but I'm that skipped generation that's returning back. The picture of the man in the suspenders is my grandfather, Alex White. He was an incredible farmer, an incredible human who, amidst a lot of cultural upheaval and boarding schools and acculturation, really kept the dignity of tending the land and doing this work. You can see Alex and my great-grandmother Rena on the porch there of our own family farmstead. There's some pictures in the middle of some ancestors of mine weaving baskets on a homestead at Akwesasne. And you can see the family there is my great-grandmother, Mary Leaf, who is an amazing basket weaver with some of my relatives. And I say this tonight, which is that, you know, we all come here with a multitude of ancestors, and to my ancestors and to your ancestors as well. I say that your hands planted seeds and they harvested foods and prepared meals from what was on hand. And they swaddled babies and they fixed fences and they delighted in the births and they wept in the passing. And they heaved prayers at the horizon, perhaps prayers that are coming to life in our hands and in our lives today. And so I'm thankful for all the memories that have passed along into my rivers of time that run generously through my blood and my bones, and that really inform the work that I do, because my hands are their hands and their song is my song. And so this story continues to move through us. And so much of what I'll come here to share, and some of the things that have sprouted in my life come from the generosity of the prayers of my ancestors, that they had the foresight and the wisdom to keep the farming tradition alive, again, amidst great upheaval. All of these people you see in these photos were taken away from their families and brought to residential schools and boarding schools. They were robbed of their language, of their culture. There was a lot of atrocities and unspeakable things that these people endured. And while many of them, my grandparents included, didn't, all of these people spoke Mohawk as a first language. My grandmother spoke Mohawk as a first language, but they didn't carry it down to my parents because of the cultural wounding that happened. And, but my relatives always said that when I was begging for those pumpkin seeds and wanting to get my hands in the dirt, or finding myself in my mom's pantry with cornmeal dusted all over me, they always said, "You're kind of taking after your great grandma Rena or my great grandma Jacobs, who had these legendary gardens." And so I love to think that, again, there's those seeds that might lay dormant for a generation or two, but that memory of who we are as Mohawk people and the agreements that we have with plants in the land are always there in the earth of our body. So that's a little bit of some of the things that will be, oops, let me just see here. I don't know why it went all the way to the end here. Let me just fix this. And so these are my first seed teachers. I found myself at 17. I left home from my family home, curious about food and where our food came from, like many of you perhaps. And my first seed teachers were actually tomatoes. I ended up on a small farm in Western Massachusetts under the apprenticeship of an amazing human, Nancy Hansen, at the Hampshire College Farm. And they had this incredible heirloom seed garden, which included 50 different heirloom tomatoes. And, you know, this Mohawk girl coming from the res had never seen tomatoes that were different from round and red. I had really only eaten tomatoes, like, you know, out of the can, or perhaps a little bit out of my mother's small little garden. But I remember my mentor, Nancy, entrusting me with this basket of seeds and telling me to go through and to learn about all these different varieties. And I remember a very cornerstone moment of being on this dusty farmhouse floor in New England, paging through seed catalogs and packets and handwritten notes on them, and making this amazing connection that not only was there this prism, this rainbow of colors and possibility and diversity that were held in the plant families of tomatoes and potatoes and corn and all of these things, but that these seeds had lineage and legacy and story, and that people and plants had been inextricably intertwined in this beautiful co-evolutionary dance for generations upon generations. And as I'll share with you as we move forward, I had heard these stories from our creation stories and in our ceremonies. But again, because there was this severing of stewardship on the land, it wasn't necessarily in my immediate family in the time when I was growing up, that some of those teachings and those understandings and those relationships had been severed because of the cultural upheaval and the violence of colonialism and the way that it impacted my ancestors and relatives. And so I always give tribute to these tomatoes. I remember reading about stories of tomatoes going from Mesoamerica over to places like Italy, where now we can't even imagine Italian cuisine without tomatoes, or those same tomato seeds generations later sown into Vesco pockets and gone back over the Atlantic back into North America, because these Italian immigrants perhaps wanted to have a flavor of home that they could remember, right? And I remember on that dusty farmhouse floor feeling this ache and this longing and unearthing a grief I don't think I had ever known or had been able to name, which is that why weren't there seeds from my own family passed down in ancestral bundles to me? And I began to ask, well, what were the seeds of my ancestors? What did they look like? What did they taste like? How could I rekindle or reignite or rehydrate my relationship to them? And so I made a promise to myself on that dusty farmhouse floor to follow that path. And that's been over 25 years of me following that relationship and that inquiry, and I'll continue to share that with you. So I'm going to talk about the meta movement of rematriation, but there is a very personal and intimate journey of rematriation of myself as an Indigenous woman, rematriating myself back into relationships with food and land and seed. And so there was a very visceral sadness and almost anger that came at that moment, where I thought, well, why wasn't this handed to me? But the beauty of working with plants is that they offer us the possibility of transforming some of these immense griefs and emotions, composting them and moving them into a more hopeful way of being. And I write about that a little bit in some of my writing. So I realized at that moment, I went home to Akwesasne and I went to some other Mohawk communities. I was 17, 18 years old. And I began to talk to elders and talk to folks about the seeds and what were the seeds that fed our ancestors. And I began to meet some amazing humans, Steve McCumber, Mary Arquette, Norton Rickert, and many others who were generously sharing seeds that they had kept in their families. Amidst all of the cultural upheaval, there had been foresighted elders and people who kept these ancestral seeds alive in our Mohawk and Fudonoshoni communities. And what I realized is that all of these people were elders, were older. And what they were telling me was that there was not a whole lot of young people who were interested in asking about the seeds or learning about the seeds, wanting to grow these seeds. And this quote by Joy Harjo, she says, "My generation is the doorway to memory, and that's why I'm remembering." And so I realized at that moment in time that my generation, if we weren't apprenticing ourselves to our elders and to the seeds and to the land, that so quickly that cultural memory and that legacy and that lineage that so many people had kept alive in the face of unspeakable acts of colonialism and violence, that in one generation it could be gone. One of my elders and mentors, Norton Rickert, passed away suddenly in the late 90s, and he had a whole libraries of memory and cultural memory knowledge. And I remember very viscerally recognizing the urgency and importance of my generation returning back to our responsibilities and agreements with our plant relatives and also within our communities. As a young woman growing up in a Mohawk community, we tell a lot of story, and this is the time of year where we tell stories in the wintertime. And our elders tell us that our creation stories, these stories of original woman and her daughter coming onto the back of Turtle Island, this abyss of water, these original stories, that those creation stories never ended, actually. They continue to unfurl and spiral and come alive into our everyday. And when you begin to listen and sit with these blueprints, these maps, these cartographies of story that were handed down from generation to generation, they're actually kinship maps. They actually help us to understand the intricate and immense web of relationship that we sit in and the agreements that we hold as people to our non-human kin, to the plants and animals and minerals. That's what our creation stories are telling us. And in our creation story, it tells us that we are actual lineal descendants of our traditional foods. Because when Sky Woman fell down from this sky world into this world that we know of now and landed on the back of the turtle, she was pregnant with child, and she had a child, a daughter, and they began to sing the world awake. She was clutching seeds from the old world and was singing the world awake on the back of the turtle, and things began to grow and beauty began to emerge here. And as her daughter grew into a young woman, she became impregnated with the west wind, children, twins of the west wind inside of the womb. And as she began to grow full with children towards the time of her birth, she began to come into labor. But one of the twins came out in a very unconventional way through cutting with this ridge on its head, cutting itself through her armpit. And the other came naturally, flint and sapling, sort of the duality of this world being birthed by our original women ancestors. And sadly, she died in childbirth, but from her body, from her grave, sprouted the foods that would continue to sustain our people from time immemorial up until now. And in her dying breath, she said, "From my body will come the foods that will feed countless descendants and children. And from her breast grew the corn, and from her hands grew the beans, and from her umbilicus grew the vining squash plants, and from her head grew the tobacco, and from her heart grew the strawberry, and from her legs grew the original potatoes and the sunflowers." And so quite literally, as Fudonoshoni people, we are lineal descendants of the very foods that find their way into our gardens, into our tables and kitchens and hearths and pantries, and into our ceremonies. And so part of this work that we're rehydrating, this dignified resurgence that is happening now with the Indigenous food sovereignty and seed sovereignty movement, is that in the face of cultural upheaval, we are restoring relationships and agreements with this cosmogenealogy, this lineage and legacy of relationship of our Indigenous seeds. And we are recreating a kin-centric food landscape or foodways that our ancestors embodied and your ancestors embodied. No matter where you come from on this entire Mother Earth, you descend from people who had creation stories just like this. You descend from people who came into agreements with plants and animals and made agreements with them to give up a little of your wildness and to be bound in this reciprocal relationship with plants. And so part of this healing and this rematriation and this journey that many of us Indigenous peoples are on, and perhaps many of you are on, is to restory our food landscape, right? That there is a cultural element to the work that we do. There is a heart and spiritual element to the work that we do that is inextricable from the very practical hands-on aspects of growing food and tending to farms and gardens. And in the last 20 plus years that I've been in community with the organic farming community at large, I've continued to be an advocate for the ways in which, in order for us to move towards cultural sanity again, in the ways that we rebuild these the possibility of kin-centric food systems is to continue to remember the cultural elements, the cultural memory, the stories, all of those pieces. And so we're gonna dig in a little deeper on that as we move forward. I descend from people who dance in our longhouse the same way that beans dance around corn. So if you've ever grown polyculture, Three Sisters garden, or been in a milpa field where there's been corn and beans growing together, the beans always grow counterclockwise around a stalk. So this is actually beans twining around a sunflower stalk in my garden. And my ancestors always said that was the moon guiding those beings. And so original woman on Turtle Island, when she saw her own daughter die in childbirth, eventually she goes up into the sky and her face becomes the ever-changing moon that is always guiding the ebbs and flows of the cycles of death and rebirth and fertility. And we actually plant by the moon in our communities. We are guided by the lunar cycles and plant by her wisdom and the way that she impacts. And so you can see in so many profound and subtle ways, the ways in which our plant relatives and our agreements to them continue to show up in the way that we show reverence and the way that we talk a little bit about this in a bit, but just the way that we encode those relationships into our ceremony and the importance of them, encoding the importance of diversity, the importance of these food and seed plants into our ceremonies and ways of life. So you can see here, this is a mapping of our Fudonoshoni ceremonial cycle. You can see it actually moves counterclockwise and moonwise. It goes around this way. And it begins at midwinter. So the very beginning of our agricultural calendar and our ceremonial calendar is midwinter. Some people think the beginning of the planting season would start in the spring when we're sprouting seeds, but all of us farmers know and gardeners know that it actually starts in the middle of winter, when we're sitting there with our seed bundles and the seed catalogs and dreaming into what's possible. And that's that dark night of the seed in the soil, is dreaming of all the possibility before the sprouting happens. And the sprouting happens in the spring when the maple syrup begins to flow and the thunderers return. And we begin to nourish and renew our agreements around the ceremonial calendar. And as I began to apprentice myself, my elders were giving me all of these seed bundles, corn and beans and squash. In fact, one of the beans was the very bean that was purported to have grown from an original woman's daughter's hands when these seeds came to us. The Mother Earth bean, Yakinista'a Ohunja, Osaheta. And they began to entrust them to me, and I began to apprentice myself to these plants and seeds. And suddenly, the ceremonies that I had witnessed in the longhouse and had been to growing up, all of a sudden became more dimensional. And there was so much more depth of understanding of what we were actually doing in those prayers and ceremonies. And the seeds, I always say the seeds took me through a very unconventional rites of passage. They became my aunties and my grandmas, sort of teaching me what it meant to be a Mohawk woman in my full capacity. It taught me how to care for things. It taught me how to cook and nourish my community. It taught me how to be selfless in my giving back and in my service to a bigger understanding of legacy and lineage. And so I continue to, to unpack and unearth layers of what this ceremonial calendar and agricultural food cycles is. Now, I won't read this verbatim. You'll be able to have access to this later, but this is a quote directly from the records of General Sullivan in 1779. These were orders given by George Washington during the Revolutionary War. And so we have Haudenosaunee people who've been living, planting, growing, renewing the ceremonial calendar and living in the way that our ancestors have lived since the dawning of time and the dawning of agriculture in our creation stories. And there was a great upheaval many, many centuries ago. And there's a lot of history there. But with the Revolutionary War, General Sullivan had orders from George Washington to literally burn our cornfields and to, by any means necessary, completely ruin our agricultural fields. And that was on purpose. That dismantling of our agricultural systems was to try and sever that relationship, because we as Indigenous peoples, we derive our power from the land, and we derive our power from our seeds and from our food. And the colonial forces knew that if they were to sever our connection to the land, and they did this, we were on the front lines, and they did this all the way through westward expansion, was purposefully dismantling food systems to disempower and create dependency for Indigenous peoples, and eventually sort of saving the man, killing the Indian, and moving that out of us. And my family, I'm a direct descendant. My grandmother was at these boarding schools where they gave these horrific mandates to essentially civilize and move the native cosmologies and the stories and the language and the cultural memory and assimilate us into white culture. And that's in living memory. My grandmother, this is my dad's mom. And that is, and we know that there are so many babies' bodies being unearthed from, the residential schools across Canada and the United States. And this is a reckoning that has to happen. But in the face of those unspeakable atrocities is this enduring, timeless Indigenous resilience that lives in the land, that we can resource ourselves from the land. And I put this picture up here because this is myself and my daughter in an ancestral cornfield of Mohawk red corn that had dwindled down to just one cob of corn on the face of the earth 20 years ago. And through the diligence of our community efforts and through our prayers and the many things that many of us have done, here I was standing in a couple acre field of red corn, and now we grow thousands of pounds of this particular seed. And I give my daughter, there are things written on her heart, knowledges and seed songs and stories and flavors and terroir and an understanding of who she is in this greater cosmology that I didn't necessarily receive in its entirety because of the legacy of boarding schools and the colonial violence. But that Indigenous resilience is always there waiting to bubble up. And our foods and our seeds bring that back into us and bring that memory and sprout it and make it alive inside of us. And so much of these stories that I'll tell of Indigenous resilience, I'm going to spotlight a few rematriation stories, is in honor of this grand lineage of seed keepers who came before us, who against all odds tucked seeds into smoky buckskin pouches and hid them, waiting for the right time for them to come back up and sprout into our lives again. And so we make renewed commitment to them to continue to do this work in a good way. Why it keeps doing that, it keeps going back to the very last slide. Go back. I guess it wants to keep moving me forward. There is a cultural dimension of biodiversity that is, so these beans here and the beans that, there's like dozens of beans that my Fudonoshoni community stewards and caretakes. And there is a very cultural dimension to that biodiversity. The way that we encode the value of that diversity into, we need a red corn for our wedding ceremonies. We need a blue corn for our naming ceremonies. We need a multicolored corn for our children's ceremonies, our white corn for other purposes, right? And so this genetic diversity, we understand our resilience is rooted in this diversity. And so our ancestors had the foresight and the wisdom to culturally encode that diversity into our everyday life. And so we'll be sharing some stories of that. And as I start to unpack this concept of rematriation, my invitation to you all is to think about, what is this new lexicon for a relational agriculture? This is what I'm talking about, relational foodways and relational agriculture. And what are the ways that we can speak life and new words into reclaiming and revitalizing foodways with words that are able to seed our imaginations of what's possible, instead of imprisoning ourselves to choices, compartments, and pathways that are just a recycling of this extractive and exploitative agricultural system that we find ourselves in. And so I want you all to be thinking about that. You know, rematriation is kind of a spin on an older word, and we're going to unpack a little bit of what that might mean for the movement and for us. In the seed rematriation, in the Indigenous food sovereignty movement, we've begun to use this word rematriation as it relates to bringing the seeds home again. In many Indigenous communities, we talk about repatriation of funeral objects or ancestral remains, things that have been thefted from our communities through, a lot of atrocities. But rematriation is this bringing home. It's encompassing this idea of returning ancestral land races and land back to Mother Earth or mother communities of origin for in situ conservation or in life conservation by farmers and community members after perhaps decades of being outside of a community in gene banks or universities. And when the seeds return home to their motherland, to their mother people, which is where they'll be nourished and protected. There's a life-giving element to the feminine, right? That's the womb, the places where life springs from. And so we made a twist on a word so that we could begin to bring that element, invite that element of healing. We know that seeds move, they move along kinship routes. We know that in times of great upheaval, our people, Mohawk people, perhaps traded out seeds to non-native people, and these seeds moved along kinship routes and trade routes and made their way to different places. And during times of immense colonization and displacement, many tribes in North America lost some of those seeds. They didn't have the capacity or the ability to steward those seeds in a good way. And so, through things like the Long Walk and the Trail of Tears, people have been forcefully relocated from places. And sometimes they carried those seed bundles, but sometimes those seed bundles didn't go with them. And so we're now working with a multitude of different institutions in this cross-cultural partnership to work with tribes and their desire to find culturally significant ancestral seeds and return them back to their communities. And so we're going to share some stories from that work. And this really is part of the NAGPRA, the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act. This is an extension of that, because what we're doing is we're saying that we have cultural matrimony, or we have cultural inheritance of seeds that exist outside of our communities. And we're making ceremony, and we're inviting partnerships of healing and reconciliation to begin to bring these seeds back home where they belong. And this is a definition of rematriation from one of my mentors, Martine Frechtel, who talks about this: any attempt to rematriate land and people and seeds and food back to the holy in nature is the beginning of cultural sanity and healing. And I see that very much in the day-to-day work that I do in helping to be a bridge and a facilitator in some of these cross-cultural rematriation stories. And so, we're finding these seeds in museums and seed banks and universities, and there are living relatives. And so we're inviting them back in good ways to our homes, in this way. I'm just gonna sort of move through some slides quickly so that you can see some of the beautiful pictures and stories from rematriation, recognizing that it's not enough to just save the seeds, in freezers or museums or universities, but that they need to be in the home gardens and in the home ceremonies and lives of Indigenous peoples and their culture. And this is part of this cultural revitalization and dignified resurgence. So we're finding these old seeds These are seeds that were unearthed from the Minnesota Museum of Science and the Field Museum in Chicago. This is returning Scattered Corn, who is this beautiful Arikara woman in the black and white photo. These are seeds that she gifted to Oscar Will in the late 1800s, and then they carried them in their catalog in North Dakota, and those seeds ended up in a museum in both Minnesota and in Illinois and Chicago, and are now being rematriated back to Jamie Holding Eagle, who's in the bottom there, and to her family and community in this beautiful full circle of her ancestor, Scattered Corn, bringing these seeds back home to the people. And so we have countless stories of this cross-cultural connection and participatory restoration of seeds happening, and centering this Indigenous leadership and ecological knowledge and cultural memory. And this is a reseeding of the people. This is a way that we're reseeding healing back into the people. And an Indigenous Seedkeepers Network is helping to facilitate these stories through Indigenous seed censuses, understanding what the state of seed is in our community, and bringing these beautiful seed relatives home. These are some of the pictures of some of the very few of many seeds that have been coming home, dozens upon dozens of varieties that are returning from places like Seed Savers Exchange, University of Michigan, Field Museum, Peabody Museum, and Minnesota Museum of Science, etc. There's going to be a few slides here of perhaps some springboards of some places where you might want to go and learn a little more. Seed Savers has been hosting a multiple part webinar series on the Seed Rematriation Partnership that myself and others initiated there, and the beautiful rich stories from these amazing communities and homes. Folks like Jessica Greendeer, who are being reunited with their Ho-Chunk seeds after many generations of them being gone. Many, many people gathering and kerneling and seeding this work in all sorts of different partnerships, recognizing that seeds are a reflection of the people. So these are some of the pictures from the Field Museum. This was an amazing rematriation that happened in Taos Pueblo, where this seed variety, this Taos Pueblo squash, was returned back in a beautiful ceremony with Henrietta Gomez and her people at Taos Pueblo. It was an incredible day. I'll never forget that day. Seeds that are coming home to our Fudonoshoni communities through multiple partnerships, ways in which we're working together to resource Indigenous communities from non-native organizations like Farm Hub and Seed Shed, creating seed hubs that are helping to feed and nourish multiple generations of people in my own home community, and creating cooperative, replicable models of seed stewardship and seed distribution in our communities. We're working with people like Deb Echohawk at the Pawnee Nation to continue to support their efforts in rematriation, not only seeds back into their community, but rematriating seeds back to their ancestral homelands in Nebraska. They were relocated through the Trail of Tears and are finding their way home to their ancestral homelands in Nebraska. You can see them working with their beautiful corns, sorting them out, selecting. Some of our work has inspired large gene banks like CIMMYT in Oaxaca, Mexico, where they are adopting some rematriation protocols so that the seeds that have been kept in these gene banks at ex situ in these vaults are actually returning back home to their landrace communities and to the people that care for them. And so here's some words from folks at CIMMYT that share the impact of this rematriation work. So you can see this is just an infographic of some of the many bundles of seeds that have been returned back to Indigenous communities across Turtle Island. Largely, we've been focusing in the United States, but we are also working with partners in Canada as well. And we're creating regenerative economic models that do not harm what we love. You know, we do this in a way that honors our cultural values and our relationships to these foods and seeds. And it takes all of us, a diverse group of folks interculturally working together to restore this culture of belonging in our foodways. And so part of this is to invite you all to think about ways that you can be a part of this movement. This is a short seed video that we did. You can find it on our YouTube channel. It's a short 7-minute film about rematriation, along with an action guide that helps share a little bit more of what you might be able to do. We partnered with the Native Seed Pod to do a series of rematriation podcasts. So head over there and listen to a handful of episodes that are directly from the voices of Indigenous folks rematriating seeds in their communities. So I invite you to go listen in there as we work on restoring the food and seed commons. I'm sure that you all will find much inspiration. These are just some images from some of the workshops and listening sessions that we've done, recognizing that we are doing this work on behalf of our children, because we don't own the seeds. We actually borrow them from our children. And so this is the work, this intergenerational work that we do to care for this lineage and legacy and be those good future ancestors. And recognizing that this is another way we show up and express this Indigenous resilience, that these seeds have stayed alive over the last many centuries of war and colonization and violence and unspeakable things, but that our people had these intimate and beautiful and reciprocal relationships with seeds and food, and kept them alive in the face of that. And in closing, I'll just say that as Indigenous peoples, we carry our nations with the same love that we carry our children, and we infuse this same thought into the way that we carry our seeds and our songs and our prayers, that our capacity to love fiercely and defend what we feel most deeply connected to is what will bring the revolution that is needed and necessary to bring about this relational concentric food system. And so I invite you all to embody and practice radical imagination in foodways revitalization and be thinking about the ways we can restore the landscape, invite in kinship and relationality and a culture of belonging into our foodways. And how are we centering Indigenous voices and Indigenous leadership in our communities as we begin to, again, find our way home through food and seed to be good future ancestors. So I'll leave you with a few questions. I know we're going to open it up to a Q&A, but I want you to be thinking about as you leave this space. I have 2 questions for you. One is, what does rematriation mean to you? I want you to be thinking about that in the hours or days or weeks to come and allowing that to settle into your bones. What might that mean in your own ancestral lineage and legacy? What are the seeds and foods that perhaps you're in diaspora from, and how can you find your way home through food and seed? And perhaps you're already doing that. How do we envision the Indigenous role in the larger food and seed commons work and coordinate these collaborative efforts to care for our seeds that's in right relationship with Indigenous cosmology and Indigenous land stewardship? And what are some of the ways in which you could envision inviting Indigenous leadership, participation, and inclusion in your farms, projects, and food systems work in the places where you reside? And so with that, I'll just leave the slide up for a minute. If you're interested in connecting with me and collaborating, you can find me on Instagram. Also, there's our website, and just really looking forward to fielding a few questions and being in conversation. Thanks so much.
Wow, Rowan, thank you. Thank you. I invite everyone in the audience to take a moment, take another breath, and allow that presentation to settle into your body.
Yeah, I just want you all, just before we jump into the Q&A, I just want us all to, as we're taking that breath, I just want you to acknowledge the ancestors that are in the space and to acknowledge, to make that renewed commitment, as I said before, to honor that grand lineage of wisdom keepers and memory keepers and seed keepers, those people who prayed that you would have food to eat, right? And so how do we read that in and recognize that we're all part of this dignified resurgence in birthing, in this transition time, and birthing the new world that we know is possible. So thanks so much for showing up.
Beautiful. Thank you. Okay, so I invite you to folks in the audience to put any questions in the chat, fill into what is emerging in terms of questions. You're getting a lot of thank yous in the chat, a lot of gratitude. And while we're waiting, I know I have a lot of questions, so we can see if folks are able to engage here. And actually, yeah, so there's a comment in the chat about living in diaspora, as you mentioned. And I'm thinking a lot about the complexity of that and pursuing and fostering this intercultural collaboration. And I'm wondering if you can speak to stories or ways that you've seen this intercultural collaboration of all these different peoples living in diaspora. Like, what facilitates that and what helps that to happen in a helpful way?
I think part of the immensity of this work is that the gardens become the shade tree of healing and reconciliation, right? And there's a very humanness, right? Like, we all eat, it unites all of us. We all descend from people who had storied, embodied connection to food and seed. And I think sometimes for people who've lived in extended diaspora, we forget that. And in the way that whiteness shows up, the way that whiteness wants to just create amnesia and disconnection and the grief of that. And so what's beautiful and what I've witnessed, like for instance, in our seed sanctuary gardens in the Hudson Valley, we have Mohawk people, Fudonoshoni people, we have people of Jewish ancestry, we had people who were from Mexico and Central and South America. We had people from all kinds of different cultural communities who would come up from New York City, from the urban community, right? So there was this real melting pot of everybody sort of working together under the shade tree of how do we be in right relationship to this land? How do we acknowledge the harms that have been done on this land and put our hearts and our minds together to work towards bringing food and seed back to our Indigenous communities and creating access and resourcing Indigenous communities to do this. But we also, in so doing, invite and open up the doorway for people to speak into, oh, well, that reminds me of this story from my culture, and finding that common ground and recognizing in a time where there is so much divisiveness and so many ways in which people see themselves distant and different from each other, there is this common ground that happens in the garden, right? There's so many ways in which we can see reflections of ourselves in the foodways, in the ceremonies, in the stories of other people. And we tend the possibility for that actually to come alive in our lives too. So for me, even coming here tonight to share my stories of rematriation and our community stories is not only to sow those seeds of hope, but it's also to open up the doorway of possibility for all cultural communities to engage in rematriation work and to confront diasporic living and say, what is it that we can do to encourage, to get a little more closer to cultural sanity again, to recognize and reckon with the grief of the current moment of feeling so disconnected, that it's really just sometimes eating certain foods that bring a certain visceral, like multi-sensory memory forward. And that is, there's so much possibility there that I don't even think we've even brought into the organic food movement yet. I don't think we've even touched the surface of what the possibility of that is. So that's a little there. I could go on and on because it's so interesting, this idea of diaspora. I've just been really grappling with it. And I'm writing a memoir right now, so there's like just a lot of thoughts around this that are really interesting to me anyway.
Thank you very much. We have a question here. So first of all, thank you for this beautiful presentation. And the question is, as a young farmer of a settler background, completely disconnected from my ancestors' farming and seed culture, embarking on a path of working with seeds, growing them to share with my community and future generations, what are some ways you suggest reaching out in a good way to local Indigenous peoples about growing and strengthening seed varieties that are important to them?
Yeah, I think I get this question a lot, and so I biggest part is to show up with humility. Like a lot of the times, like in a lot of circles, it's like we do it. Some people do it to assuage their guilt, or it's so easy to get into like a savior mentality of like, oh, we're gonna like sort of help the native people. But where you start at is that common ground of just relationship building, right? Is just getting to know your neighbors, resourcing them. Like for instance, here in Nisenan territory, where our family farm is now, we have it's called CHIRP. It's an ancestral reciprocity program where we are actually paying people are invited in our community to pay land tax to the Indigenous peoples to resource themselves, to be able to grow to engage in food sovereignty, to be able to, build back certain things. So it's not necessarily something that's transactional, but it's how are ways you're giving back in meaningful ways, but not in just like a one shot, like I'm just sending a check over, but like, how are you greeting them and saying, I have these resources and tools. Like for instance, in that Hudson Valley partnership, Hudson Valley Farm Hub had amazing farm equipment that they were able to lend. They had land that they opened up for use for the Mohawk people. Seed Shed and Hudson Valley Seed Company had knowledge and skill set and technical assistance that they could lend, into the partnership. It was very mutually beneficial, right? It wasn't necessarily this sort of savioristic thing, but it was relational. It was building that trust. And the arc of trust is in these intercultural and cross-cultural partnerships is not going to be this like smooth arc upwards. It's going to be, there's going to be high moments and low moments. There's going to be, there's a lot of, internalized narratives that we have to work through. But I think just being human to human with one another and just, connecting in and resourcing, like I said in that last slide, land back, sharing the mic, platforming these people. What are the ways in which you're, hosting events and allowing these Indigenous elders or leaders or community members to center their leadership and their visions and their thought process. So there's a lot of ways. It's complex, but it begins with building relationships first.
Thank you. Thank you for that question from the audience. Okay, we are right at 6:30. I am wondering if you do, oh, go ahead.
It's a lot to hold. Like the concept of rematriation was big. And so you all will have those slides. I know there's some text on them. Feel free to dive in, and there's some springboards. But I just want you to know that there's an invitation here. There's an invitation for us to think about what is the place of rematriation in our larger organic food movements and in our communities. And so like that's a little call to action and invitation. Like in your very intimate personal life, what are the ways in which you're engaging in acts of rematriation in your own cosmology and cosmogenealogy, and reconnecting and researching and rehydrating those. I always say that our agreements to plants and animals and to land, they're held in our blood and our bones. And so when we start to eat our traditional foods again, they get rehydrated, and they begin to spark again. So what are the ways you can invite those ancestral foods back into your life? And then in the bigger food movement, what are the ways in which you're advocating for Indigenous voices and leadership and vision to be able to, again, move past just this like white, cis, hetero male leadership in regenerative ag that just seems to be so ever present? And how are we making sure that BIPOC folk, Indigenous, Black bodies of culture who have a more visceral and more ever-present understanding of what cultural sanity looks like and relational kincentric agriculture looks like, how can we begin to get them in those places and resource them. So grateful for our time together. Kristen or Caitlin, I don't know if you have anything to add in closing.
I have in my mind a question, like your gift with words, and like you're saying, the way that words can unlock potential, and this concept of radical imagination and remembering. I'm wondering if you've shared so much with us tonight, and I'm just wondering if there are any words in closing to help paint a picture of cultural sanity. Like, how do you see it? What do you imagine? What does your radical imagination see?
I mean, I think more than see, I think I taste and smell. Like, it's multisensory, right? This understanding of recognizing that this revolution is intergenerational. I think ultimately what I see centered is that it's artful and it's beautiful, that we're centering beauty in the work that we do, and relationality and the beauty in that. Like, the cultural sanity from my ancestors is we dance for food and seed. We have seed songs. We have beautiful things that invite beauty. And I have an elder who always said this to me. He said, love what you love more than you hate what you hate. And the only way that we're going to actually move towards that beautiful vision of cultural sanity again is to not just be against things. It's not just to be against GMOs or against conventional agriculture or against, exploitative labor practices. We need to do that, and we need people on the front lines, but we simultaneously need all of us to be able to immersing ourselves in tending to life-giving things and to tending to what it is that we love. And if we don't do that, then we will burn out. We won't have the capacity to hold our radical imagination. And so the ways that we can invite in artistry and imagery and mixed media and poetry and like all of the aspects, because this is ultimately culture work. This is ultimately the work that we're doing is culture work. We have to grow ourselves into humans who are possible, who are capable of being of old growth forest again. We have to grow ourselves into people who are capable of holding storied cosmological food systems again. And that's intimate work. That's very, very intimate work. And so I think the invitation for, I guess I'm going to spin that question to the audience, and maybe this is the takeaway, is beginning to think about what does cultural sanity feel and taste like and smell like, and in all of those multisensory ways, what could that be? And it's been in the past, and it certainly exists into the future. And how are we carving the pathways towards that in creating equity and creating possibility for all of us to move in that direction? So big question, big words, but excited to dream and to imagine alongside you all.
Yeah. Well said. Incredible. Just feeling so much gratitude for you being with us. Thank you.
Great. Well, be in touch, everybody. And you can follow me on Instagram. It's like my microblog. I'm always posting little snippets. I have a Patreon. So please feel free to, just come work alongside us. And we're going to move towards that vision, that beautiful, irresistible future that we know is possible. So thank you all.